Ethan sat in his dimly lit apartment, a haven of solitude he had curated with meticulous care. The walls were adorned with unfinished canvases, their muted colors mirroring the grayness of his life. His brushes sat untouched on a cluttered desk, the dried paint on their bristles a testament to dreams long abandoned. At just 28, Ethan had retreated from the world, carving out a life in the shadows. He moved through his days like a ghost, existing but not truly living. Ethan was once a rising star, a talented athlete with a promising career. He had been the kind of person others admired, confident, full of life, and surrounded by friends. But that was before the accident. One night, a reckless driver had changed everything. The car crash left Ethan with visible scars on his face and body, but the damage went far deeper. The incident shattered not just his bones but his spirit, stripping away his identity and his future. Surgery and physical therapy addressed the physical wounds, but nothing could repair the fractures in his soul. He had once been someone who turned heads, someone whose charm and talent drew people toward him effortlessly. Now he avoided mirrors, unable to face the distorted reflection of the man he had become. He hid from the world, venturing outside only when absolutely necessary. His neighbors rarely saw him, and his friends had slowly faded away, unable to bridge the chasm his isolation had created. Ethan didn't blame them. He had pushed them away before they could reject him. It was easier that way. The fewer people who saw his scars, the less he had to confront them himself. His only solace lay in art. What began as a distraction during recovery turned into his primary means of expression. But even this had become a source of frustration. Each time he tried to capture his emotions on canvas, he found himself stuck, paralyzed by self-doubt. His paintings felt incomplete, much like his life. Every brushstroke reminded him of the person he used to be, and the gap between that past and his present. One evening, as he sat staring blankly at a half-finished painting, a soft rustle broke the silence. A flyer had been slipped under his door. Startled, Ethan hesitated before picking it up. It was for a local art exhibit hosted by a community group, inviting both amateurs and professionals to showcase their work. The bold, cheerful font and colorful design felt out of place in his dreary apartment. He almost tossed it aside, but paused when he read the tagline, "Art heals the heart." Ethan scoffed at the sentiment, his lips curling into a bitter smile. What did these people know about broken hearts, about scars that never faded? But something about the flyer lingered in his mind. The name at the bottom, Lily, stood out. There was something comforting about it, though he couldn't quite place why. The exhibit was a week away. Ethan told himself he wouldn't go. The idea of stepping into a room full of strangers, exposing himself to their judgment, felt unbearable. Yet as the days passed, he found himself drawn to the possibility of connection. Maybe these people wouldn't judge him. Maybe they would see his work, not his face. And if nothing else, it was a chance to leave his suffocating apartment, if only for a while. On the morning of the exhibit, Ethan stood in front of his closet, debating what to wear. His reflection stared back at him from the mirror, a face marked by faint scars that traced a map of his pain. He ran his fingers over them, as he often did, a mixture of shame and defiance coursing through him. He didn't want to go. But deep down, he knew that staying would mean letting his fear win yet again. With a deep breath, Ethan grabbed his coat and stepped out into the brisk evening air. The world outside felt overwhelming, the colors too bright and the sounds too loud. He walked slowly, keeping his head down. But as he approached the venue, a wave of nervous energy rippled through him. The building was alive with light and laughter, the hum of conversation spilling out onto the street. For a moment he considered turning back, but then he saw her. A woman with kind eyes and a warm, open smile stood by the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. She exuded an air of calm that seemed to cut through Ethan's anxiety. This, he realized, was Lily. Her presence drew him forward, even as his heart pounded with doubt. As Ethan stepped inside, the world seemed to shift. For the first time in years, he felt the faintest glimmer of something unfamiliar. Hope. He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he believed about himself, and perhaps even heal the parts of him he thought were irreparably broken. Ethan sat at the farthest corner of the art group's room, his shoulders hunched as if to make himself smaller. He had arrived earlier than everyone else, wanting to avoid the awkwardness of introductions. Now he was questioning his decision to come at all. The faint hum of conversation filled the air as people trickled in, carrying sketchbooks, paintbrushes, and canvases that seemed to radiate purpose and confidence. Ethan felt like an outsider, clutching an empty sketchpad he hadn't touched in years. The smell of coffee and acrylic paint mingled with the warmth of the space. The community center wasn't fancy, but it had a charm to it. Soft lighting, vibrant artwork on the walls, and shelves overflowing with art supplies. It was clear that this was a sanctuary for those who came here. Ethan couldn't help but wonder if it could ever feel like one for him. Before his self-doubt could spiral further, a familiar voice cut through his thoughts. "You made it," Lily said warmly, her smile as genuine as it had been the night they met at the exhibit. She pulled up a chair next to him, her presence grounding him in a way he didn't expect. "Barely," Ethan replied with a nervous chuckle, his fingers fidgeting with the edges of his sketchpad. "That's more than enough," Lily said, her tone light but reassuring. "It's your first day. You don't have to do anything except be here. No pressure to create, no pressure to share. Just exist in the space." Her words were simple, but they settled over Ethan like a comforting blanket. For so long he had felt the weight of expectations, his own and those of the people around him. Lily's approach felt different. The session began with Lily introducing a simple activity, drawing or painting something that symbolized how each person was feeling in the moment. Ethan's chest tightened. He wasn't ready to put his emotions on paper, not when he wasn't sure what those emotions even were. He looked around the room, watching as the other participants dove into their work. There was a teenage girl sketching a tree with bare branches, an older man painting a swirl of blues and greens that reminded Ethan of a stormy sea, and a young mother carefully blending pastels into what looked like a sunrise. Ethan's pencil hovered over his blank page. The emptiness stared back at him, mocking his inability to begin. He sighed and started drawing lines, hesitant, uneven, disconnected. The more he tried to make sense of them, the more frustrated he became. Lily must have noticed his struggle because she quietly returned to his side. She didn't say anything at first, letting the silence between them settle. Then, she asked softly, "What's holding you back?" Ethan hesitated, the words caught in his throat. He could tell her the truth, that he didn't know how to face his scars, let alone translate them into art. Or he could make an excuse, something easy and dismissive. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw no judgment, only understanding. "I guess I'm afraid," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Afraid of what will come out if I try, and afraid of what people will think when they see it." Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Art is a mirror, isn't it? It reflects what's inside us, even the things we try to hide. But that's the beauty of it. It's not about perfection. It's about honesty." Ethan looked down at his page, her words echoing in his mind. "Honesty," he repeated. "Yes," Lily said with a small smile. "And the best part? Here, no one's going to judge you. This group isn't about creating masterpieces. It's about creating connections, with yourself, with others, and with the things you've been too afraid to face." Something about the way she spoke, so calm, so certain, nudged Ethan forward. He began to draw again, this time letting his pencil move freely. The lines took on a life of their own, forming shapes he hadn't planned. It wasn't much, just abstract swirls and jagged edges, but it felt like a release. As the session went on, Ethan found himself observing the others more closely. He saw their struggles, their triumphs, their quiet determination. It occurred to him that everyone here had their own scars, even if they weren't visible. By the time the session ended, Ethan had managed to fill his page. It wasn't pretty, but it was his. A small step toward something he couldn't quite name yet. Before he left, Lily caught him at the door. "How was it?" she asked. Ethan shrugged, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Not terrible," he said, which, for him, was high praise. The building was alive with light and laughter, the hum of conversation spilling out onto the street. For a moment he considered turning back, but then he saw her. A woman with kind eyes and a warm, open smile stood by the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. She exuded an air of calm that seemed to cut through Ethan's anxiety. This, he realized, was Lily. Her presence drew him forward, even as his heart pounded with doubt. As Ethan stepped inside, the world seemed to shift. For the first time in years, he felt the faintest glimmer of something unfamiliar. Hope. He didn't know it yet. But this was the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he believed about himself, and perhaps even heal the parts of him he thought were irreparably broken. Ethan sat at the farthest corner of the art group's room, his shoulders hunched as if to make himself smaller. He had arrived earlier than everyone else, wanting to avoid the awkwardness of introductions. Now he was questioning his decision to come at all. The faint hum of conversation filled the air as people trickled in, carrying sketchbooks, paintbrushes, and canvases that seemed to radiate purpose and confidence. Ethan felt like an outsider, clutching an empty sketchpad he hadn't touched in years. The smell of coffee and acrylic paint mingled with the warmth of the space. The community center wasn't fancy, but it had a charm to it. Soft lighting, vibrant artwork on the walls, and shelves overflowing with art supplies. It was clear that this was a sanctuary for those who came here. Ethan couldn't help but wonder if it could ever feel like one for him. Before his self-doubt could spiral further, a familiar voice cut through his thoughts. "You made it," Lily said warmly, her smile as genuine as it had been the night they met at the exhibit. She pulled up a chair next to him, her presence grounding him in a way he didn't expect. "Barely," Ethan replied with a nervous chuckle, his fingers fidgeting with the edges of his sketchpad. "That's more than enough," Lily said, her tone light but reassuring. "It's your first day. You don't have to do anything except be here. No pressure to create, no pressure to share. Just exist in the space." Her words were simple, but they settled over Ethan like a comforting blanket. For so long he had felt the weight of expectations, his own and those of the people around him. Lily's approach felt different. The session began with Lily introducing a simple activity, drawing or painting something that symbolized how each person was feeling in the moment. Ethan's chest tightened. He wasn't ready to put his emotions on paper, not when he wasn't sure what those emotions even were. He looked around the room, watching as the other participants dove into their work. There was a teenage girl sketching a tree with bare branches, an older man painting a swirl of blues and greens that reminded Ethan of a stormy sea, and a young mother carefully blending pastels into what looked like a sunrise. Ethan's pencil hovered over his blank page. The emptiness stared back at him, mocking his inability to begin. He sighed and started drawing lines, hesitant, uneven, disconnected. The more he tried to make sense of them, the more frustrated he became. Ethan sighed and finally let his pencil touch the page. Slowly, lines began to form, a jawline, the curve of a cheek, the shadow of a nose. But the moment he began shading the scars, his hand trembled. The lines came out jagged and harsh, distorting the image. His frustration boiled over. He tore the paper from the sketchpad, crumpled it, and shoved it to the side. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ruined sketch as anger and shame coursed through him. Lily, who had been quietly circulating the room, noticed his distress. She walked over and sat down across from him, her movements unhurried and calm. "Rough day?" she asked, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "I can't do it," he said, his voice tight. "I can't look at myself like this." Lily didn't rush to respond. Instead, she looked at the crumpled sketch on the table, then back at Ethan. "I get it," she said finally. "After my sister passed away, I couldn't look at myself in the mirror either. I kept seeing someone who should have done more, who should have been better." Her words caught Ethan off guard. He glanced at her, surprised. "You?" Lily nodded. "Grief has a way of distorting everything, how we see the world, how we see ourselves. But over time, I learned that it wasn't about what I saw in the mirror. It was about what I chose to see. That's why I started painting again. It gave me a way to see myself differently." Ethan didn't respond right away. Her honesty had created a small crack in the walls he had built around himself, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to let that crack grow. "You don't have to get it right today," Lily added gently. "Art isn't about perfection. It's about exploration. And sometimes it's about letting yourself feel whatever comes up, even if it's messy, even if it hurts." Ethan left the session that day feeling drained, but also slightly lighter. Lily's words lingered in his mind, playing over and over like a melody he couldn't forget. He realized that she wasn't asking him to fix himself or his art. She was simply asking him to try. Over the next few weeks, Ethan began opening up more, both on paper and in conversation. He found himself sharing fragments of his story with Lily during breaks or after sessions, bits and pieces of the pain he had kept locked away for so long. In return, Lily shared more about her own journey. She told him about her sister, about the guilt and grief that had nearly consumed her. But she also spoke about the healing power of art, how it had helped her transform her pain into something meaningful. Ethan found comfort in their conversations, though he still held back the darkest parts of his story. He wasn't ready to show her, or anyone, the depth of his scars. One evening, near the end of a session, Lily made an announcement. The group would be hosting a small showcase in a month, giving participants the opportunity to display their work. It wasn't mandatory, she emphasized, but it was a chance to share their journey with others. The room buzzed with excitement as people began discussing which pieces they might submit. Ethan, however, felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. The thought of putting his work on display made him want to bolt from the room, but before he could slip away, Lily approached him with her usual calm demeanor. "I think you should consider it," she said, her tone encouraging but not pushy. Ethan shook his head. "I'm not ready for something like that." "You might be surprised," Lily said. "You've made so much progress, Ethan. Your work deserves to be seen. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. And that's what people connect with." Her words stayed with him long after he left the center that night. As he lay awake in bed, he thought about the paintings and sketches he had created over the past few months. One piece in particular came to mind. A haunting, abstract depiction of fire and shattered glass. It was raw and unpolished, but it was honest. The next day, Ethan pulled the painting out from where he had tucked it away and stared at it for a long time. He saw the chaos in it, the pain, but he also saw strength. He wasn't sure if he was ready to share it with the world, but for the first time he thought he might be willing to try. Ethan's journey toward self-acceptance was far from over, but the walls he had built around himself were beginning to crack. And through those cracks, light was starting to pour in. Lily had seen something in him that he couldn't see in himself, a resilience, a beauty in his scars. Slowly but surely, he was beginning to see it too. Ethan spent the weeks leading up to the art showcase battling an internal storm. Each time he looked at the painting he had chosen to submit, a raw, visceral depiction of himself trapped in a fiery wreck, he felt a surge of conflicting emotions. It was a piece he had poured his soul into, but it terrified him. What would people think when they saw it? Would they understand the pain behind it? Or would they see only the ugliness Ethan had been hiding for years? The day of the showcase arrived faster than Ethan was ready for. He stood in the middle of the gallery, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets as he watched attendees milling about. His painting hung in a prominent spot on the far wall, its dark, jagged strokes a stark contrast to the softer, more colorful pieces surrounding it. He had tried to position himself inconspicuously, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the reactions of the people who stopped to view his work. Some looked intrigued, tilting their heads as they studied the chaotic lines and bold colors. Others moved on quickly, their expressions unreadable. But it was a sharp, dismissive comment that froze Ethan in place. "Looks like someone had a bad day," a man muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear. His companion laughed awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable, but said nothing. Ethan's stomach twisted. He knew he shouldn't let the words get to him, but they echoed every fear he had about exposing his vulnerabilities. His scars, his pain, everything was on that canvas for the world to see, and it felt like he had made a mistake in thinking anyone could understand. Before Ethan could slip away, Lily appeared at his side. She had a way of finding him at just the right moment, as though she could sense when he needed her the most. "People are talking about your painting," she said softly, her voice calm but laced with pride. Ethan shrugged, trying to play off the comment he had overheard. Not all of them seemed to like it. "Art isn't about being liked," Lily said firmly. "It's about being honest. Your piece, it's powerful, Ethan. It makes people feel something, and that's what matters. Not everyone will understand it, and that's okay. The ones who do, they'll never forget it." Her words settled over him like a balm, soothing the raw edges of his insecurities. He looked at her, wondering how she always seemed to know exactly what to say. "Do you really think it's any good?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Lily turned to face him fully, her gaze unwavering. "I think it's more than good. It's real. And that takes courage." Later that evening, as the crowd thinned out, Lily found Ethan sitting on a bench in a quiet corner of the gallery. She handed him a cup of tea and sat down beside him, her presence as steady and reassuring as ever. "Do you remember the first day you came to the art group?" she asked, breaking the silence. Ethan nodded. "I was a mess," he said with a self-deprecating laugh. "You were brave," Lily corrected him. "You showed up, and you've kept showing up even when it was hard. That's not something everyone can do." Ethan stared into his tea, her words sinking in. He had spent so long focusing on his shortcomings that he hadn't stopped to acknowledge the progress he had made, and now, sitting here with Lily, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Lily smiled, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "You don't owe me any thanks, Ethan. This is all you. I'm just glad I get to witness it." The showcase marked a turning point for Ethan. The experience of sharing his painting with others, even with its moments of discomfort, gave him a new perspective on his art and himself. He began to see his scars, both on his canvas and on his body, not as flaws, but as parts of his story. They were reminders of what he had survived, symbols of resilience and strength. Inspired by this shift, Ethan started working on a new series of paintings. Each piece explored themes of transformation and rebirth, with bold, sweeping lines and vibrant colors that contrasted sharply with the darker tones of his earlier work. He found himself pouring hours into his art, losing track of time as he let his emotions guide his brush. Lily often stopped by to check on his progress, offering gentle encouragement and thoughtful feedback. Their bond deepened during these moments, their conversations moving beyond art to encompass life, loss, and the quiet joys they had both begun to rediscover. One evening, after a particularly productive session, Ethan found himself lingering at the community center long after everyone else had left. Lily was tidying up, humming softly to herself as she worked. There was a peace about her that Ethan found both comforting and disarming. "Lily," he said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could second-guess them. "There's something I've never told anyone." She stopped what she was doing and turned to him, her expression open and attentive. "I'm listening," she said simply. Ethan hesitated, the weight of his story pressing down on him. But he saw no judgment in Lily's eyes, only a quiet strength that gave him the courage to continue. He told her everything, about the accident, the guilt he carried, the friends who had drifted away, and the years he had spent hiding from the world. His voice trembled at times, but he pushed through, laying bare the pain he had buried for so long. When he finished, there was a long silence. Lily didn't rush to fill it. Instead, she crossed the room and sat beside him, her presence grounding him in a way words never could. "I'm so sorry you went through that," she said finally, her voice steady but full of emotion. "But Ethan, you're still here. You've fought so hard to get to this point, and that's nothing short of incredible." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe her, to believe that he wasn't just his scars or his mistakes, but someone who had survived, and someone who could thrive. That night, Ethan felt a sense of liberation he hadn't known was possible. Sharing his story with Lily had lifted a burden he hadn't realized he was still carrying. And as he walked home under the glow of the streetlights, he found himself smiling. A small, quiet smile, but one that felt deeply and entirely his own. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, and through the cracks, light was pouring in. And in that light, he began to see not just the scars, but the beauty they held. Ethan's studio was filled with the soft glow of morning light as he stepped back to survey his latest painting. It was his most personal work yet, a self-portrait that integrated his scars into a phoenix rising from the ashes. The image was raw and powerful, the scars on the phoenix's wings not flaws but part of its strength. The piece told his story in a way words never could. The decision to submit it to a public gallery hadn't come easily. Even after all the progress he had made, Ethan wrestled with the vulnerability of putting this part of himself on display. But Lily, as always, had been there to encourage him. "This painting is you," she had said, her voice filled with conviction. "It deserves to be seen. You deserve to be seen." Those words echoed in his mind as he carried the painting into the gallery, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. The opening night of the exhibit felt like a blur. Ethan stood near the edges of the room, watching as people gathered around his painting. He had prepared himself for indifference, or worse, criticism. But as the evening unfolded, something extraordinary happened. Viewers lingered in front of his piece, their expressions a mix of awe and emotion. He overheard snippets of conversation, people describing the resilience they saw in the phoenix, the way the scars added depth to its beauty. One woman wiped away tears as she whispered to her companion, "It's like it's telling me my own story." For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of his fears begin to lift. His painting wasn't just a reflection of his pain, it was a connection to others. It spoke to their struggles, their scars, and their victories. When the gallery curator approached him later that night to tell him his painting had received the most attention of the evening, Ethan could hardly believe it. "You've created something extraordinary," the curator said. "It's more than art. It's a statement." In the weeks that followed, Ethan felt a shift within himself. The acclaim his painting received was validating, but it wasn't what mattered most. What truly moved him was the realization that his scars, the very things he had spent years hiding, could inspire others. With Lily's support, Ethan began exploring new ways to share his art and his story. He held small workshops at the community center, teaching others how to channel their emotions into creativity. At first, it felt daunting to stand in front of a room full of people, but each session left him more fulfilled than the last. One day, after a particularly heartfelt workshop, Ethan found himself alone with Lily in the quiet of the studio. The air was thick with the smell of paint and the faint hum of the city outside. "Did you ever imagine this?" Lily asked, gesturing to the room around them. Ethan shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. "Not in a million years, but it feels right, like I'm finally doing what I was meant to do." Lily reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "You've come so far, Ethan. I hope you're proud of yourself, because I am." Ethan turned to her, his heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. "It's because of you," he said softly. "You saw something in me when I couldn't see it in myself." Lily smiled, her eyes shining. "All I did was hold up the mirror. The rest was you." Over time, their bond deepened into something neither of them had expected, but both had hoped for. Their relationship grew slowly, organically, built on the foundation of trust and mutual understanding. Lily's warmth and unwavering belief in Ethan helped him see the beauty she had always seen in him, while Ethan's resilience and creativity inspired Lily in ways she hadn't anticipated. They spent quiet evenings together in his studio, talking about life and art, laughter mingling with the soft scratch of pencils on paper. On weekends, they explored the city, finding inspiration in its hidden corners and vibrant streets. For Ethan, it was as if the world had opened up again and Lily was the one holding the key. Years later, Ethan stood at the front of a classroom, looking out at a group of aspiring artists. The room was filled with the soft buzz of anticipation, the kind that always accompanied the beginning of something new. He held up a small canvas, one of his earliest works, a chaotic swirl of lines and colors. "This," he said, "was one of the first pieces I made after I joined an art group. I hated it at the time. I thought it was messy, incomplete, but now I see it differently. It was the first step in a journey that brought me here." He looked around the room, his gaze meeting the eyes of each student. "Art isn't about perfection, it's about honesty. It's about taking the parts of yourself you've been afraid to show and putting them out into the world. Because when you do, you realize you're not alone. Your story, your scars, they can inspire others. They can change lives, and maybe, just maybe, they can change your own." As the class began their first exercise, Ethan felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Lily standing beside him, her smile as radiant as ever. "You're incredible," she whispered. Ethan smiled, his heart full. "Only because I have you." Their journey together hadn't erased the scars or the pain, but it had transformed them. They had built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. a life filled with love, purpose, and the quiet, profound joy of finding beauty in the scars. And as Ethan watched his students begin their own journeys, he knew with certainty that he had finally found his place in the world.